Okay, you can hear me? Great. Got it.
I cannot see her.
Welcome, everyone. Hello. Welcome to this discussion on the Permian Basin climate bomb. My name is Miguel Escoto. I am West Texas field advocate with Earthworks, and we're here to talk about the climate crisis, and that means that we need to talk about methane. Methane, right, this very dangerous greenhouse gas to the climate crisis. Well, if we want to talk about that, we need to go right to the region where we're a part of, the Permian all the way to the Gulf Coast, right? So, yeah, I can go ahead and introduce our speakers here. These are awesome, awesome community leaders. So I'll start with Sharon here. Before she became known as Texas Sharon, Sharon Wilson was living on a farm where she had a ringside seat to the beginning of the fracking boom. She and her family lost clean air and safe, beautiful well water. That experience brought her to her life's work with Earthworks as a senior field advocate and thermographer. Sharon is one of my mentors, and an awesome brag about Sharon is that she was blocked by Exxon on Twitter personally. So that's an accomplishment in my eyes. And then we have John Beard. John is the founder and CEO of the Port Arthur Community Action Network, Pecan. Pecan is a nonprofit CBO focused on environmental and social justice community development in Port Arthur. He has over 30 years of public service as a city councilman and other elected positions. He is retired. He's a retired petrochemical plant worker, using his industrial and political knowledge to bring community-based solutions into fruition. So welcome, Sharon. Welcome, John. And yeah, we can go ahead and get started in this discussion. So quickly to recap, what do we mean by the Permian climate bomb, right? So the Permian is a region in southeast New Mexico, West Texas, that produces a lot of oil and gas. Current numbers are 5 million barrels of oil per day, and it's expected to increase. But it doesn't just stop there, right? The amount of oil and gas that's produced there has an impact all along Texas and Louisiana through the Gulf, where you live, John. So just to kick us off, I'll ask you, why is it important for us to think of this framework as a Permian to Gulf Coast situation? We'll start with Sharon first.
I think it's important to think of it as Permian to Gulf Coast to all around the world, because methane is a global problem now, and so it impacts everyone. Locally, it impacts the people who live nearby, because the methane brings with it volatile organic compounds, and they cause serious health impacts, and they're an impact to the local air quality. But then the methane is a global issue, and everything with oil and gas, petrochemicals, fertilizer, plastics, it all starts with a hole in the ground. First, they drill, and that's where the industry says, well, we spent all this money drilling this well, we are vested. Yes. So then they can use a legal bludgeon to build out all the infrastructure that they need, that they don't tell the public. They just say, we're going to drill a well. They don't tell you it's going to have pipelines and compressor stations and processing plants and more pipelines. And now we have refineries and LNG export terminals. And so it's pervasive, and it's everywhere.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to go really in depth about what you have seen. You're a certified optical gas imaging thermographer. You've seen these methane emissions in the ground, in the oil field. But yeah, I'll throw it over to you, John. Why is it important for you as a community member in the Gulf Coast to think of this situation regionally?
Well, we have to think of it regionally, but we also have to think of the implications globally
Right.
that it has, because
Right.
there's been a lot of talk and recent movement in the industry to export a lot of the gas from the Permian to other parts of the world. So while we think globally, we have to look locally at what's happening. As Sharon was mentioning, there are local impacts to people, like happened on her farm and the farms of others, or in the communities in various cities. But then that gas is transported to the Gulf Coast to export around the world. And it has effects locally also on the community, on the lives and health of people, and on the very fact of just general living itself. With the build out that she talked about of pipelines, with the build out of petrochemical facilities and plastics facilities, and the other effects that come from that. So this is a global issue. It's not just a local issue, it's globally in terms of its impact and how it affects people and affects the planet.
Right. Yeah, and like we mentioned, we're going to go really in depth about painting the picture of what it means for our communities throughout Texas, throughout the Permian, the New Mexico area, all the way to the Gulf. We're going to go really in depth to talk about that. But before we go into that, I wanted to ask if we can dive a little bit deeper into what it means for oil and gas in the Permian to emit methane, right? Because if we hear this number, 5 million barrels of oil per day, that sounds scary. That sounds like a very counterintuitive thing to what we should be working towards in the climate crisis, right? But how does that translate directly to methane emissions? What do you see with your camera on the ground in the Permian?
You can stand, in some places you can stand in one spot and look this way and see some metal, you see some tanks, you see some pipes sticking up, and when you look through the camera, you just see clouds of methane just blasting out everywhere. And a lot of people say methane leaks. That term, leaks, is misused. What I see are intentional, routine emissions, that pressure releases. I see equipment malfunctions. I see when they have to empty the equipment of all the methane, they just blast it into the air. So it's like a Mad Max type situation. It looks like otherworldly. And you can turn the next way and you can see the same thing all the way around in a 360-degree circle. And I can tell you that if people could see through my lens, there would never have been a fracking boom. But the industry lied to us, told us this is clean energy. They spread lots of propaganda. They intimidated people who spoke out. They've sued me twice because they do not want the public to hear what I have to say. And if people could see what I see, there would never have been a fracking boom. And yeah.
It's really eye-opening for me personally when I first went with you, because we talk very much about the climate crisis and how dangerous oil and gas production is. But to see with your own eyes, for example, an unlit flare or a tank that's releasing, for me at least, it was able to materialize and visualize what the climate crisis looks like and its production, right? So we can spend a few minutes to share with our viewers, with our audience, what some of these specific sources of emissions can look like, right? So I'll first ask you about flares.
Here's a flare.
Tell us about the T-shirt that you have on.
This is an unlit flare, and there's just a pipe sticking up here, and then this is a cloud of methane and volatile organic compounds. I first saw this flare unlit in 2016, and I tracked it many times over a year and a half, and it was never lit, not once when I visited it, and even despite making many complaints to the TCEQ, it was never lit.
Right.
So this is a big problem. The industry cannot seem to keep their flares lit or properly operating. So sometimes it'll be lit, but it's still putting out a lot of pollution because it's not completely combusting the methane and volatile organic compounds. But when I first started going to the Permian Basin in 2017, 11% of the sites that I visited had an unlit flare. The first quarter of 2020, 34% had an unlit flare. So the price of gas was low at that time, and a lot of the operators, even if they had a pipeline that went right to their site, it cost them money to transport the gas to market. So it's easier to do things like just release it through venting or vent the flare. But about the time when the number jumped to 34% is when the public became aware of all of the lit flares. And you can't see an unlit flare from space. So if you don't light your flare, it's not really a flare, it's a vent pipe.
Right. And just for clarification, a lit flare looks just like a ball of fire that is spewing out from a pipe in the ground, right? That's connected to the production. But what you see here on your shirt, this cloud of methane, that's invisible, right? People can't see it with the naked eye.
It's totally invisible.
Totally invisible.
Without a camera.
So yeah, this is a sort of important community education that we should be doing, right? That even though you can't see it, these unlit flares are having a tremendous impact on the climate. But it's not only flares, it's also tanks, right?
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about the relationship with all of these tanks and how that emits?
Oil and gas comes up, all mixed together, the oil and the gas and all the liquids, and they do separation on site. But when they put the tanks, don't hold gas, they hold liquids. But the liquids has associated gas with it, and that separates, rises to the top of the tanks, and it becomes volatile. So they have to release that.
Right.
Because otherwise it will overpressurize, and they have to release it to protect equipment. So it could explode. So the tanks have vents on them that release the pressure. They can put vapor recovery systems on the tanks, and the idea is that those would then recover those tank vapors and put them in a sales line, or they would route them to a flare for destruction. But what we see is that the vapor recovery units fail. They're not reliable. They depend on electricity. So every time the electricity goes down, which is pretty often in West Texas, the vapor recovery units fail. Mm-hmm. And then we find them failing for many reasons. I've documented many times huge clouds just blasting out from these vapor recovery units.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about flares, we've talked about tanks. Lastly, I want to talk to you about pipelines, and we can transition over to how that affects John's region. So pipelines have to hook, there's just an extreme build out of pipelines and a web of connections from the Permian all throughout West Texas, New Mexico, even down to the coast, right? Tell us about how pipelines can emit methane.
A pipeline can leak from many different points where there's connectors, and there's many ways that pipelines can leak. They also have, mysteriously, pipeline vents that are intended to vent gas out of the pipeline. I don't know why. But one of the big events that they have, when they need to work on a pipeline, they have what's called a blowdown, and that is very intense. If you witness, it sounds like you're sitting under a jet engine. Yep. The gas just blows out with great force, and this happens often. and they empty the pipeline out so that it won't be dangerous to work on the pipeline. But it doesn't just happen at pipelines. It also happens at compressor stations. They can have a blowdown from a tank.
Right.
Many pieces of equipment, they have to just let the gas out to so that they can work on it. And they don't really have to do it that way. There are better ways that they can do it, but it's not mandated, and they're not going to do anything voluntarily. It's got to be mandated with regulations.
And that's an important topic that we're going to talk about in the close, which is what are some of the solutions. And Texas state government has proven time and time again that they're not interested, right? But yeah, we're mentioning pipelines that hook up the Permian right through the coast, right? So, John, I want to ask you, how does the infrastructure build out of oil and gas look like? What are some of the projects that the oil and gas industry has to build in order to support this extreme level of production?
Well, here's something that gives you a picture of what it is. Where I live in Jefferson County, Texas, Port Arthur, Beaumont area, and including Orange, as a population of about 250,000 people. There are 6 times more miles of pipeline than people. 6 times more. When I first got into the, I guess you would say, business of politics and public administration, I was told by a city manager that became one of my mentors that if you were to buy a house or buy property anywhere in the city, first thing you need to do is have a title search and assessment done to determine what's under the ground, because you never know what's under the ground. And I've seen incidents where people were building homes and in the course of laying the foundation strike a pipeline and come to find out there was oil in that pipeline. It was abandoned, but nobody ever knew it was there where it came from. So you have an area that's crisscrossed with a latticework of pipelines to service all of these various industries, from the largest refinery in the country to many smaller other facilities and refineries that are interconnected with each other, to the shipping that brings the oil in and out from that area, and also the interconnects of other types of services. So all of these things dovetail into each other and create that problem. And when you have the gas from the Permian coming in to supply these facilities to create more oil and gas and other products, you have a scenario that just heightens and elevates the possibility of leaks and accidents and emissions just that much more.
Right. So from what you've mentioned, we've got pipelines. You've mentioned refineries.
Right.
And then export facilities, right? So a lot of this business of oil and gas production in the region has to do with shipping out these materials.
That's right.
Not for the production in the U.S. necessarily, right?
Right. When the export ban was lifted, it allowed this country to not only export finished product, but now crude oil products and gas. And the Port Arthur area is very unique. We have 2 current LNGs in the immediate environs of Port Arthur, Cheniere and Golden Pass LNG, a subsidiary of ExxonMobil. And you also have Sempra that's trying to come into that area. And several others have looked at it. So it's a very important shipping area because of its access to the Gulf and to other world markets. And exporting this gas is very problematic. It's not really a solution to the problem. It's, as we call it, a false solution. But you have, in the entire Gulf Coast area, over 20 facilities being proposed, 9 of which alone are just LNGs, along the entire Gulf Coast, from the tip of Texas and Brownsville all the way to the tip of Florida. So it's incredible as much as what they're talking about doing and exporting all of this gas. You talked about the volumes of gas and oil that comes from that. And let me say something else too, and Sharon hit on it a little bit. It's not just simply about gas per se, but oil has gas entrained in it. So in the course of processing this in these various facilities, you have more oil and gas that comes out of it. You know, you don't find one without the other. You're going to always find when you drill oil, gas, in some cases water too. So all of that is entrained together. And when you process that to make the plastics we have all around us in our world, which is becoming a very significant problem, to the very fact of burning and using oil and gas, all of this is all interconnected, and it all starts with pipelines.
So you mentioned very quickly when the U.S. Lifted their ban on crude oil exports.
Right.
That was around 2015, right?
Yes.
So how does that relate to the Permian, right? Because something very important happened around that time, which was the boom, right? How are those two things connected?
The oil in the Permian Basin is not oil that the U.S. has the capacity to refine.
Right.
So when they overturned the crude oil export ban, that actually gave birth to the Permian Basin climate bomb. It started booming. They started fracking out there and exporting the gas. And oil and gas executives have said that every molecule of oil and gas from the Permian will be exported. So they're using our natural resources, our water, our clean air, some of our best farm land where a lot of agriculture was grown, and they're using all of that to export dirty fossil fuels to other countries at a time when other countries need to be, along with us, transitioning to renewable energy.
Right. So now I want to transition a little bit more into some of the community impacts, right? We've walked through how it looks like, right, from an industry perspective, why the region is important, at how much it affects the climate. So, but now I'm hoping we can zoom in a little bit more about these communities. So, John, if you'd like to go first, can you talk a little bit about what your community of Port Arthur looks like, if you can paint a picture of that, and how industry affects it?
Yes, well, let's first start off by saying that Port Arthur is on the Gulf Coast. So as I like to say a lot of times, when you look at the weather map or a map and you see where Louisiana and Port Arthur, or in Texas rather, and the Gulf of Mexico meet, that's where Port Arthur is. We're on a coastal plain and prairie. But one of the things you'll notice, you'll see these markers all over the place showing where pipeline routes and corridors are. And you'll see the refineries. You know, if you come at night, sometimes you'll look and you think you're seeing a bustling, booming metropolis with great skyscrapers and all, but that's just equipment that fuels the industry, that fuels the beast of the petrochemical industry in terms of oil and gas. And you also see that these pipelines are not only under the ground, but they're also above the ground going to these various facilities. And then when you look at the city itself, you know, you're always hearing this promise about oil and gas and the money it brings and the increase in the quality of life and the standard of living. But that hasn't happened in Port Arthur. Port Arthur is largely a city of about 55,000. That's a community of color, mostly African Americans, Hispanics, Orientals, and also the white community. Mm-hmm. But the prosperity that's always supposed to come with oil has largely bypassed this community. Mm-hmm. I happen to say that if you look at the city during the daytime as opposed to night, it looks like Beirut. It looks like it's bombed out and depleted. A large number of vacant lots where there were people formerly, but because of the change in the industry, they moved away. Some of them died away. You also have a large number of older buildings and structures that need a lot of work, and some of them are not even habitable, but people are living in them. So all of the promise of prosperity, all of the good things they say that happen, don't happen. It's a false promise that's given and painted about that. So as people come and see all of these different vessels and towers and things, they need to know and understand what's going on and what's happening. That this oil and gas, that Port Arthur is sacrificed. So this country and other parts of the world can have oil and gas, yet at the same time, the prosperity that should come from it bypasses cities like Port Arthur and a number of other cities along the Gulf Coast too.
You use the word sacrifice, right? Which goes to this concept of a sacrifice zone. In order for the U.S. to be one of the leading exporters of oil and gas, there needs to be sacrifice zones.
Well, I wouldn't say there need to be sacrifice zones, but they are consequently sacrificed.
Right. There are consequences.
They're sacrificed because in order to do this, you bring in this case of now with the boom and expansion with over tens of billions of dollars in expansion, with ExxonMobil's upcoming expansion, advertising the need for 7,000 workers, and then you also have the other ongoing expansions at other facilities. You know, you would think with all of this money being concentrated in such a small area that it would look like a boom town. Well, it doesn't. We have some of the highest unemployment in the state. You know, the only places that have worse unemployment are down in the valley where there's no heavy industry. Mm-hmm. Then you also have the worst thing of all, and that's the health effects.
Right.
The health of people are affected by emissions and by the pollution that comes from these facilities. So yes, in order for America to have that and concentrate it all in one area with these facilities, we are sacrificed because we have some of the worst air quality.
Right.
And a byproduct of that is what? We have a high number of people with heart, lung, and kidney disease. We also have a significant number of people, matter of fact, more than twice the state and national average for cancer. So with all of this going on and people not living and being healthy, because air is life. There's life in the water and the soil, but with so much pollution, you can't live and breathe and be healthy. So just think of that picture of people like Miss Etta Hebert, who is a cancer survivor, but her husband is in hospice now, only just recently at the turn of the year, having surgery for cancer. Etta's daughter, Angela, is a cancer survivor. Etta's brother, Eddie Brown, who started the boxing academy in Port Arthur and all of that, he died 10 months ago from cancer. I dare say that if you go to Port Arthur and meet someone on the street, you'll probably not find a single person that either hasn't had cancer in some form touch them or their lives or someone they know. So that's very alarming that the gas and all of this from this industry can cause that. And the frack gas from the Permian adds to that, because now you've got these new facilities coming up at LNGs, and they've tacitly said that they're going to have emissions which are going to contribute to worsening the air quality. Well, how do we do this? How do we continue to make things worse but yet think they're going to get better? Once again, that's a false promise and that's a misconception. It's not going to get better as long as you keep pumping more in and exporting more gas to other places.
Everything has a consequence, right?
Exactly.
As Sharon says, it all starts with a hole in the ground, and it ends up with high levels of cancer, right? So,
Right.
can you speak a little bit more about, because it isn't only Port Arthur, right?
Oh, no.
There are many other communities along the Gulf fighting back against oil export terminals, petrochemical plants. Can you speak about other communities, other fights that are in solidarity with you, fighting the same
Yes.
industries?
Well, there are many others. In the Matagorda Bay area, they're looking at dredging the ship channel and doing some things which is going to upset something that we did years ago, back in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of dumping of mercury and heavy metals that's in the ship channel, that's because of its heavy metalness and being like that, it's in the mud, in the very dredge material that they're going to be dredging up. That's going to put more into the biosystem there and also into the Gulf of Mexico. And the Gulf of Mexico is where we do what? Swim, eat fish and seafood from there, and generally recreate. Once again, water is life, so that's going to be affected. Then you also have what's going on to my east in Lake Charles, Louisiana. A number of these facilities are built directly on the Gulf Coast in coastal prairies and marshes to liquefy natural gas for export. But what we're doing at the same time is destroying habitat that's very beneficial. And worst of all, what we're doing is creating further subsidence and erosion of the land so that the natural protection from these storms in the Gulf, which, by the way, Port Arthur's been impacted by 5 in the last 15 years. And 2 of those storms happened last year within 2 months of each other, which was Delta and Laura, hit within 15 miles of each other. So all of that area is affected. And other points along the Gulf Coast are showing ecological damage, the damage to the terrain, and then the effects of global warming, which is increases these weather phenomena associated with the large freezes that we have, as well as the hurricanes. So all of this is affected by, just as Sharon said, that hole in the ground.
Right. So you painted a great picture of how we're suffering along the coast, right? Communities are fighting back. You mentioned the dredging of the Bay Area. For example, Diane Wilson engaged in a hunger strike to bring attention to that. We also have the Rice St. James group fighting the Formosa petrochemical plastics.
Right.
But there's also directly impacted communities when you drill a hole in the ground, right? Sharon, can you speak a little bit more about how communities are affected even directly on the ground when they start fracking in your backyard?
Yeah, I can start with my own story.
Right.
I bought 42 beautiful acres in Wise County, Texas, And I didn't know at the time that the father of fracking, George Mitchell, was experimenting to learn how to produce oil and gas from shale right in my backyard. So I got an early ringside seat to that adventure. The first thing that happened, the lights, all the drilling rigs everywhere. When I first noticed them out in the distance, I thought, well, that's just a cell tower or electric line they're putting in. But as they moved closer and closer, I started parking on the side of the road and just watching them. I've been observing oil and gas sitting on the side of the road, watching their operations for 20 years. And the first thing that happened is it affected our air. And then the lights, we lost our stars. I could see the Milky Way from my property when this first started. And that was a big source of our entertainment because we didn't have a lot of money. So we would watch the stars and learn the constellations. And that was the horses, the dogs, the goats, everything would gather around and we would just watch the stars and the coyotes. We could hear them serenading. And it was just simple and a very beautiful time. But eventually we couldn't see the stars anymore. You can't see the Milky Way out there because there's so many bright lights. And then the air started turning brown. And my little boy would run to the window every morning when he got up and he'd say, "Mom, why is the air brown? Why is the air brown out here?" And it was brown. Yeah. And then the worst thing that will ever happen, your worst day, is when you go turn on the tap to get a glass of your beautiful, crystal, ice-cold well water, and nothing comes out. But the house would shake and shake and shake, and then blast of air would come out. It was terrifying because the whole house was shaking. And then after a period of time, I'm trying to hold it together because without water, you cannot make coffee in the morning. Yeah. That's the first thing I think of. You cannot brush your teeth. You cannot flush the toilet. I couldn't bathe my little boy, which he knew that was a rule. You take a bath every night because that kid could really get dirty. And, he was very upset when I put him to bed without a bath. He didn't understand. He knew something was really off. So eventually the water did come back, but when it first came back, it was just black, a black blob with a string, and it just went plop. It was black and slimy, plopped in my sink, plop, plop, plop. Eventually, it started running, real sandy and gray, and then it cleared up. I didn't drink it again. Unfortunately, my horses and animals had to drink it, but that is a story that I've heard far too often. But the first impact that people usually have is air. And so a story from the Permian Basin, Jim and Sue Franklin contacted me, and I'd been on their street because it was one area where it's the worst unlit flares and tank emissions I'd seen. It was just horrible. And I wondered who lived in this little house and how they could survive. And it was Sue and Jim Franklin. Right. Jim is a Vietnam veteran. He flew a helicopter in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. He did 4 tours. Mm-hmm. And then he moved to the Permian Basin and bought about 10 acres out there where they could enjoy the stars like I did, the coyotes, the animals, the wildlife. And the desert is a beautiful, beautiful place. It's all the colors of green and the flowers everywhere when it's blooming. And the sky with all the fluffy clouds, that's gone. It's very smoggy out there. There's a lot of ozone. But Jim and Sue were horribly impacted on their property because the unlit flares and all of the tank emissions were gathering at their house. Some of it settles down low to the ground. It was going under their house, and they had horrible health impacts. Sue had to move to their rock shop. They own a rock shop in Balmorhea. She had to move there. Jim stayed, but it was a great cost to his health. I saw his health decline over the time I worked with them. Eventually, they were able to move away, but their health has never recovered. And they would not have survived staying there long term. It was one of the worst cases I've ever seen. And I've been helping people impacted by oil and gas for 11 years.
Yeah, your story and the story of Jim and Sue really give me hope and strength, because you all fought back, right? Jim and Sue didn't just stay there and quietly accept their fate. They spoke up, right? And just 2 weeks ago, John, myself, Jim, and Sue were right across the street of the White House, demanding that Biden take climate action. So people are fighting back.
But that's rare. Really, that's rare,
Right.
because a lot of people are afraid. They're afraid, and rightfully so. I've been sued twice. I mean, I won, but it was a horrific experience. But they get the intimidation and aggressiveness of oil and gas if you speak out. They're rightfully afraid to speak out much.
Yeah. So, we're going to move on to the next portion of our conversation, which is solutions, right? What can we do about it? But before I do that, I did want to point out about just another piece of this production impacts is it seems counterintuitive that you can have your own land, but oil and gas can go onto your land and extract oil and gas, but that's because they have rights to the minerals and others have rights to the land, right? But this entire region is really affected. We can share a quick statistic about volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which are oftentimes a byproduct of oil and gas production, right? So in the Midland Odessa region, which is epicenter of the Permian Basin of this climate bomb, there is more VOC emissions in this region than the entirety of Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston. For some context, for those that aren't from Texas, Midland and Odessa is collectively about 500,000 people. Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston combined are 9 million people. So there is just an incredible amount of pollution that's affecting this region. Also the water, right? You mentioned water in your story. There are hundreds and thousands of oil and gas wells that are just left there, abandoned by the oil and gas industry. So how does that affect the general region's water?
As these wells age,
Yeah.
the casings corrode, and one ranch in West Texas, it's contaminated her well water. It's bubbling up to the surface. It's just making a mess. A lot of people mention water impacts, and it's sometimes, it's hard to find out all the impacts, because if a landowner is able to get good science, the industry will usually give them a settlement, and that settlement comes with a non-disclosure agreement, so they can't talk about it anymore.
Right.
But one of the things about the air in Midland, Odessa, I've been watching the air monitors, the state air monitors out there,
Right.
and tracking benzene, because that's something that people know about, and we know it's a known carcinogen. It is not safe at any level. There is no safe level of benzene exposure. And the American Petroleum Institute did a study in 1948, and the conclusion of that study was that there is no safe level of benzene exposure. Yet in Midland, Odessa, on the state air monitors, 1 week, a couple of weeks ago, 6 days, they had, one day they had 6 hours over what the state declares the safe exposure level, which is not safe.
Right.
But what the state, 6 hours
Yeah.
in one day Sometimes, some hours, it was many over. And during 6 days, every day they had several hours over the safe level of benzene exposure. So
Yeah.
it's really bad out there. That is truly a sacrifice zone.
So we've got sacrifice zones where they drill oil and gas. We have sacrifice zones all throughout Texas where they build out pipelines, where they build out refineries. We've got sacrifice zones in the coast where they do export terminals and other petrochemical plants, right? So that is a very important piece that I hope we clearly demonstrated and could inform the lens through which we go into the next portion of this conversation, which is solutions. How do we fix this? How do we fix this methane problem, this climate crisis problem, in a way where the communities that are directly impacted benefit and they don't continue to be used as a sacrifice zone, right? So, very simple question to you all about defusing this climate bomb. Do you feel that President Biden has been enough of a climate leader?
No, he has not kept his promise to be a climate leader. Very slow to do anything. And the new methane rules that were released, we need to try to regulate methane, but the rules that were released are very weak. They're not what we need. And the other thing about methane regulation is that I want to know is how. How are we going to regulate this? Because currently, there has never been a system that could adequately regulate oil and gas, protect the public, protect the climate. That system does not exist. So we have to figure out how to create that system. And that I don't think that people understand how vast it is. It's everywhere. It's in people's backyards. It's in every nook and cranny of neighborhoods and cities and out in the country. And it is everywhere. It will take an army to regulate this. And we know that voluntary regulation is not going to work. We need enforcement. We need investigation. We need investigators out on the ground monitoring this all the time. And that's my question is, what is the plan? Because methane rules are words on paper until we have a plan for how we're going to execute this.
A quick stat on that is that for every oil and gas well that there is in the Permian region, there are 2 people. So the ratio is 2 people for 1 oil and gas well. That tells you how much hundreds of thousands of wells there are and how much massive of a problem it is, right? So I'll ask the same to you, John, especially coming back from the People versus Fossil Fuels week of action in D.C. that you participated in.
Yes.
What were some of the messages there? Is Biden being enough of a climate leader?
Let me put it like this. Let me recast this a little, if you will. Biden said we have to build back better to rebuild America. And we've come to the conclusion to build back better, you got to build back fossil free. And he said he was going to, as Sharon said, be the leader, to take the lead, to make generational change. And so far, he hasn't done that. You know, with the stroke of his pen, by administrative executive order, he could make the changes necessary to usher in a clean green age, to usher in some equity and fairness for the sacrifice zones that have given up so much in order to power this. But now we see that our very way of life, our very planet is being threatened by it. And that's going to require some changes. You know, we were talking all recently, and it reminded me of something that we said. And one of those things is that you cannot use the master's tools to disassemble the master's house. That house was built with political might that was in many cases bought by big oil and big business. You're not going to tear it down with the same tools. You're not going to even have access to those tools. The key tool is the money. But we have the numbers in terms of people. Then we also have the resource of looking at ourselves. You know, you mentioned earlier about having hope, and Sharon talked about having courage to be able to move forward. Well, to be able to do that, we have to continue to work with each other and strengthen each other to be able to make these moves, because if we don't, we can't get the policy changes that are going to be needed to give proper oversight and also to create stiffer penalties and fines to do better. These companies are not going to do it, just as you said, voluntarily. They've never done it. It has always taken mandates from the federal government. The states won't even do it. Right now in Texas, they're trying to basically say, get the EPA to give TCEQ authority.
Right.
And my organization and myself have met with TCEQ numerous times to show them this is insufficient. It's not protecting people's health, and it's not protecting their lives and their property. And that's all that they have. So there has to be a change fundamentally in how we do this. And Biden can do it with the stroke of his pen. And he can institute this clean, new, green age. But there's too much talk about a transition and doing it for 2030. And yet you've got people, as we talked about earlier, talking about 2050, 60, and 70 to reduce by half. We don't have that luxury. We don't have that time. And there's some that'll deny the science or whatever. But if they're wrong, you know, not saying that we'd be right, but if they're wrong about this, just imagine the damage it would do. Just imagine if we allowed this Permian bomb to go off. Mm-hmm. Well, it's going off. The more gas and oil we use and ship and put into the system, we're going to have that problem. So we're going to have to, with legislation, with public policy, and with changes in the way our government leaderships operate. And that's going to start from the bottom up with people.
Right.
People are going to have to make those demands. We're going to have to put pressure on big business to do better and to have a better way. And then we're going to have to pressure our elected officials to follow through and actually put teeth into the laws, rules, and regulations to protect lives and health.
Right. So you mentioned people power, right? How important it is for communities and movements to pressure politicians.
Right.
A lot of the times, Sharon, we hear industry say, don't worry about that. It's okay. You don't need to mobilize. We can improve, right? You've been in this fight for over a decade now, looking at this. How have you assessed industry's ability to improve?
I've been hearing promises. They've been making and breaking promises for over 10 years. And I think in any other relationship, if someone was making and breaking promises, you would break up. I think it's time to break up with oil and gas.
Yes.
What really needs to happen is we need to stop all new permits. And that has to come, unfortunately, that has to come from Congress. But we need to stop all new permits. They need to stop expanding oil and gas because it is everywhere.
Right.
And then just try to regulate. That's when we really need to crack down and regulate what we've already got and enforce those methane rules, stronger methane rules than what were already proposed. Mm-hmm. And if Biden would declare a national climate emergency, then he can immediately, with a stroke of his pen, he can reinstate the crude oil export ban. He can put a ban on exporting LNG. He can stop a lot of these big infrastructure projects that will lock us into decades more of oil and gas. He can do that today,
right.
Immediately, right now. He could do that, and I don't know why he's not doing that, but he needs to.
He can also ban fracking on public lands. There's so many things that he can creatively do, but it seems like we need to pressure him a lot more, and that's what our social movements can do. So right. I do want to ask you about oil and gas workers, right? One of the biggest talking points that industry tries to use against us is, well, you can't criticize us because then where are all these oil and gas workers going to go, right? So I'm going to ask you something, Sharon, then go to John. How does the oil and gas industry in the Permian harm workers?
It's horrible. One of the worst things that I've ever witnessed is when the workers go up the stairs, along the catwalk, on top of the tanks, and they have to open the tank hatches to take measurements and samples. And when they open those hatches, this is a volatile gas that is under pressure. It blasts out like a big mushroom cloud. I've seen this so many times. I have videos of it. And 19 men have died, at least 19 men have died doing this. There is an alternative practice that is recommended by the American Petroleum Institute, but the oil and gas industry will not adopt this recommended practice. They will only do it where it is mandated. It's mandated on federal land, but it's not mandated anywhere else, so they don't follow it. And that gives you an example. They will not voluntarily do anything, even when it will save their own workers' lives.
It goes to the structural character of what this industry does, right? They put profits over people consistently. John, you can speak a little bit about that. You used to work in a refinery.
Right.
Can you tell us about how workers were treated there, and how the character of how industry treats workers in the refinery relates to what Sharon just said about the oil fields?
Well, it's kind of like this. They have to take certain measures to help and take care of the people. But one thing you have to keep in mind is the life expectancy of people that live long enough to retire. And then what they do after they retire, what kind of quality of life and their health during that time. And a lot of it is not good. I've had a number of friends that didn't get to retirement. And I had friends that died on the job. Matter of fact, I have a cousin that died in the course of doing her work from being exposed to gas. And this gas was, H2S, hydrogen sulfide, because of a malfunction or failure in some of the company's equipment. But what's even more concerning, or should be concerning to people, is not only what affects the employees inside the plant, but how these poor practices and poor things that they do affect people on the fence line outside of that. That gas doesn't know anything about a fence line or barricade tape or anything. It goes where it goes. And where it goes, it leaves effects. So those workers are affected most immediately, but the community is affected also. And it's largely because, just what you said, Miguel, they place profit over people. But we have to flip that paradigm. People should come first, and then we look at profit, because the profit is in the people. If the people can't work and work effectively and efficiently, then they're not going to make money. We can do both. But there's still this mindset that, no, we can't have one. We can't only have one. We can't have both. Well, that's got to change. We have to protect people's lives so they can be profitable, and so the companies can profit, and so our lives can profit too.
Do you think the oil and gas workers have a role to play in this new green economy?
Oh, yes, but definitely have a role to play in it. And while I understand the concern many of them have about it, the key word here is transition. How do we go from dirty fossil fuels to clean, green, renewable energy in a just format? And that's something that has to be really fleshed out and worked out. Or as Sharon said, it's got to be more specific. How do we get there? What do we do? What are the steps? And one of the things I would even say and recommend is, in making this transition, you have to have plans in place to give people the proper training and to create the jobs where they are. Or basically, like we've discussed previously, you're not going to miss a paycheck. You're going to get the training, you're going to get everything you need, and you're going to transition over so you can keep the lights on, food on the table, send those kids to college. That type of assurance will make the transition easier. But we've got to plan it and put it in place. It's not going to happen by itself, and I most certainly don't think it's going to happen without significant pressure on the petrochemical industry to make that happen and to be a part of that change and that transition.
So last thing I'll mention here is later today there's also going to be the signing of a global methane pledge, right? So that is a promise, ambition for 30% reductions across all sectors by 2030. What is your impression of this pledge, and how should we interpret it?
I'm happy to see that methane is getting global attention. It needs to get global attention, and I'm happy to see countries making this pledge. But a pledge is not a plan. So they have to have a plan on how they are going to do this, and that's the hard part.
Last thing, we can close off with this. What is your 30-second message to President Joe Biden?
Declare a climate emergency immediately and use those powers to reinstate the crude oil export ban, stop exporting natural gas, stop some of these big infrastructure pipelines. And for Pete's sake, have the EPA step in and rescind Texas's implementation of the Clean Air Act, because Texas cannot do it, and they will not.
John?
I agree with what Sharon said, but I'm going to shorten it down from 30 seconds into saying this. Joe Biden, keep your word. You gave us your word, keep your word. And put that pen to work. Take it out of your pocket or wherever it's at and put it to work and sign those orders in place to do just what Sharon said, to stop the exports, stop the petrochemical build out, stop the leasing of new federal lands for more drilling and oil, because we can't do this by putting more into the system. To decarbonize, you got to keep it in the ground. So let's do that. Put the pen to work. Keep your word.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Sharon. To end off, we'll remind our audience, our viewers, that you can learn more about this Permian Basin Climate Bomb at permianclimatebomb.org. It's a multimedia website and report. There's more material and content that's coming out. So, yeah, please check that out. And thank you again for helping us discuss this important issue.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thanks.
That last